The October sun painted the golden leaves of the oak trees lining Beacon Hill with a soft, melancholic light. The red brick Victorian mansions rose majestically along the cobblestone streets, each telling stories of generations of wealthy families who had shaped Boston throughout the centuries. Among these historic residences, at number 47 Louisburg Square, stood the imposing house of Vincent "Vinny" Torino, a four-story construction that breathed elegance and power. Vinny adjusted the knot of his Italian silk tie while observing through the second-floor window of his house. At 42 years old, he carried the weight of an empire built on foundations that few dared to question. His dark hair, already sprinkled with silver strands at the temples, was perfectly combed back, and his dark brown eyes reflected an intensity that few could sustain for long. The navy blue Armani suit fit perfectly to his athletic physique, maintained through rigorous training that served both to keep in shape and to discharge the tensions of a life constantly under pressure. "Mr. Torino, the car is ready," announced Tommy Benedetto, his driver and bodyguard for more than 15 years. Tommy was a robust man of Sicilian origin, with hands that seemed capable of breaking bones with the same ease with which they held the steering wheel. His loyalty to Vinny was absolute, forged through years of mutual trust and situations that tested the limits of both. Vinny nodded, taking the Rolex Submariner watch that had belonged to his father and placing it on his wrist with the reverential care of someone handling a sacred relic. That watch had timed decades of decisions that shaped Boston's underworld, and now it marked the time of a new generation taking control. "How is Marco today?" asked Vinny as he descended the mahogany staircase, his footsteps echoing on the Italian marble that covered the entrance hall. The walls were decorated with classic paintings and black and white photographs that documented the Torino family's history on American soil, from his great-grandfather's arrival from Sicily in 1923. "Rosa said he had a good morning at school," Tommy replied, opening the front door. "She picked him up on time and they had lunch together. From what I heard, he was excited to show something he learned in science class." Vinny's face softened momentarily upon hearing about his son. Marco was his only connection to a world that didn't involve threats, tense negotiations, or decisions that could cost lives. Since Isabella's death, his wife 2 years ago in a car accident that still haunted him during sleepless dawns, Vinny struggled to balance his professional life with the responsibilities of being a single father. The black Cadillac Escalade awaited them at the property's circular entrance, its engine purring softly like a powerful feline ready to attack. The dark windows reflected the surrounding trees, creating a visual barrier that protected its occupants from curious gazes. Vinny settled into the beige leather back seat, automatically checking the 3 cell phones he carried, one for family, another for legitimate business, and the third for matters requiring absolute discretion. As Tommy navigated through Beacon Hill's narrow streets toward the north end, Vinny observed the city he knew like the back of his hand. Boston was a metropolis of contrasts, where modern skyscrapers shared space with colonial buildings, where prestigious universities coexisted with working-class neighborhoods, where centuries-old traditions mixed with technological innovations. It was in this complex environment that the Torino family had built their influence, adapting to changes while keeping their roots deeply planted in the Italian-American community. "The meeting with the Castellanos has been confirmed for 3 o'clock, Tommy informed, his eyes alternating between traffic and the rear-view mirror, always alert to possible threats. "Sal said they want to discuss the port situation. It seems the Irish are trying to expand their operations into territory we've controlled for decades." Vinny frowned, his fingers drumming on the leather seat. The O'Sullivan family had been a constant headache in recent months, testing limits that had been established through blood-sealed agreements decades ago. Patrick O'Sullivan, the Irish clan's patriarch, was a cunning man who took advantage of any sign of weakness to expand his influence. The recent death of Don Giuseppe Torino, Vinny's uncle and previous family head, had created a power vacuum that several groups were trying to fill. "The Castellanos have been our allies for 3 generations, Vinny murmured, more to himself than to Tommy. But loyalty is a currency that quickly devalues when money is at stake. We need to show that the leadership change doesn't mean weakness. The car stopped in front of Café Vittoria, a century-old establishment in the heart of the North End that served as a neutral meeting point for delicate discussions. The aroma of espresso and freshly made cannoli mixed with the characteristic smell of spices and imported cheeses emanating from neighboring shops. Tourists walked along the narrow sidewalks, photographing the brick facades and Italian flags fluttering in the windows, oblivious to the negotiations that shaped the neighborhood's destiny. Vinny entered the cafe with the confident posture of someone who belonged to that place. The owners, a Neapolitan family that had managed the establishment for 4 generations, greeted him with the respect reserved for men of influence. He was led to a table in the back, away from curious eyes and indiscreet ears, where Salvatore Castellano and his 2 sons, Anthony and Michael, were already waiting. Sal Castellano was a 68-year-old man with completely white hair and wrinkles that told stories of decades navigating the turbulent waters of organized crime. His blue eyes, inheritance from an Irish grandmother, shone with a sharp intelligence that had allowed his family to prosper even during the most turbulent periods in Boston's history. Anthony, the eldest son, was a younger version of his father, while Michael, the youngest, possessed the impetuosity typical of someone who still needed to prove his worth. "Vinny, my friend," said Sal, standing to greet him with a warm embrace that masked the underlying tension of the meeting. "You look excellent. The responsibility of leading the family suits you well." "Sal, always a pleasure," Vinny replied, returning the greeting while discreetly assessing the body language of the 3 men. "Anthony, Michael, I hope you're well." The initial conversation revolved around pleasantries, family health, legitimate businesses, neighborhood changes. But Vinny knew that this diplomatic dance was just the prelude to more serious discussions. While savoring the strong, bitter espresso, he observed the subtle movements of his interlocutors, reading between the lines of unspoken words. "Times are changing, Vinny," Sal finally said, his voice low but loaded with meaning. "The Irish no longer respect the old agreements. Patrick O'Sullivan thinks he can redraw Boston's map according to his convenience." Anthony leaned forward, his dark eyes shining with an intensity that reminded him of his father in his youth. "They intercepted 2 of our shipments last week. It wasn't coincidence. Someone is passing information to them." Vinny's jaw contracted imperceptibly. Betrayal was the gravest sin in his world, punishable with consequences that served as examples for others who might consider breaking loyalty codes. "Do you have suspicions about who it might be?" Michael, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. "There are rumors that some of the younger men are dissatisfied with how things are conducted. They think we should be more aggressive in our expansion." Vinny studied the young Castellanos' face, noting the poorly disguised ambition in his eyes. Michael represented a new generation that had grown up watching mafia movies and playing violent video games, romanticizing a world that their parents and grandparents knew as a brutal and implacable reality. This disconnection between fantasy and reality was a constant source of concern for more experienced leaders. "Aggressiveness without strategy is the fastest path to self-destruction," said Vinny, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Our fathers and grandfathers built this empire through patience, planning, and mutual respect. We won't throw all that away because of some young people's impatience." The meeting extended for 2 more hours, with detailed discussions about distribution routes, profit percentages, and strategies to deal with the growing pressure from the Irish. Agreements were made, alliances were reaffirmed, and plans were drawn to send a clear message that the Torino family would not tolerate disrespect to their territories. When they finally left the cafe, the sun was already beginning to tilt toward the horizon, painting Boston's sky with orange and pink tones. Vinny felt satisfied with the meeting's results, but also tired from the constant weight of responsibilities he carried. Every decision he made affected not only his own life, but the lives of hundreds of people who depended on the organization's stability and prosperity. "Home, Tommy," he said, settling back into the Escalade's rear seat. "And call Rosa. Tell her I'll arrive early today. I want to have dinner with Marco." As the car navigated Boston's streets toward Beacon Hill, Vinny closed his eyes and allowed his mind to wander to thoughts about his son. Marco was a bright and curious child, with his mother's dark eyes and the mischievous smile that reminded Vinny of his own childhood. Since Isabella's death, he had made an effort to be present in the boy's life, but the demands of leading a criminal organization made this increasingly challenging. Rosa Martinez had been an unexpected blessing in their lives. The 35-year-old Mexican woman had arrived in Boston 6 months ago, recommended by a domestic employment agency that served wealthy families. Her previous experience included working for diplomats and executives, and her references were impeccable. More importantly, she had established an immediate connection with Marco, filling a maternal void that Vinny knew he could never completely fill. Vinny's business phone vibrated, interrupting his thoughts. It was a text message from one of his lieutenants, informing him that the port operation had been completed successfully and that the Irish had received the intended message. He smiled slightly, satisfied with his organization's efficiency, but also aware that each small victory was just a step in a much larger war. When the Escalade turned onto Louisburg Square, Vinny noticed that the house lights were on, creating a welcoming glow that contrasted with the coldness of the negotiations that he had conducted during the day. That house represented more than just a home. It was a sanctuary where he could, at least temporarily, set aside the weight of the crown he carried and simply be a father. "Thank you, Tommy," he said, getting out of the car. "Tomorrow we start early. We have a meeting with the lawyers about the Las Vegas investments." Tommy nodded and left, leaving Vinny alone at his property's entrance. He breathed deeply, inhaling the fresh October night air, and prepared to make the transition from feared Mafia Boss to the loving father that Marco knew. It was a transformation that required not only a change in posture, but a complete reorganization of his priorities and emotions. As he climbed the marble steps toward the front door, Vinny had no idea that his life was about to change in a way that all his years of experience in Boston's underworld could not have prepared him for. What he was about to discover in his own home would challenge everything he believed about education, family, and the legacy he wanted to leave for his son. The key turned in the lock with a soft click, and Vincent Torino crossed the threshold of his house, not knowing he was about to witness something that would forever change his perspective on what really mattered in life. The mahogany door closed behind Vinny with a muffled sound that echoed through the entrance hall. The house's silence was broken only by the tick-tock of the German pendulum clock that had belonged to his great-grandfather, a piece that had survived the Atlantic crossing and decades of family changes. The golden lights from the crystal chandeliers created dancing shadows on the walls, giving the residents an atmosphere of timeless elegance that contrasted drastically with the brutal world Vinny had left behind on Boston streets. He loosened his tie and removed his jacket, hanging it carefully in the carved oak closet near the entrance. His movements were precise and deliberate, a reflection of a life where every gesture had meaning and where the appearance of control was as important as actual control. The weight of the Glock 19 in his internal holster constantly reminded him of the reality of his existence, but within those walls, he allowed himself to believe he could just be Vincent, the father. "Rosa! Marco!" he called, his voice echoing up the marble stairs leading to the upper floors. Normally, the sound of running footsteps and his son's animated voice would immediately respond to his calls. But today, there was only silence. Vinny frowned, automatically checking his watch. It was 4:30 in the afternoon, a time when Marco was usually doing homework or playing in the game room. He walked through the house, his steps muffled by the Persian carpet covering the hardwood floor. The formal living room was empty, with its Italian leather armchairs and marble fireplace that was rarely used. The library, with its floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with books in Italian, English, and Latin, was also deserted. It was an environment Isabella had loved, where she spent hours reading while Marco played at her feet when he was still a baby. Vinny climbed the stairs, noticing that the light in Isabella's office was still on. He had kept the room exactly as she had left it, with her art books, her plants that Rosa religiously cared for, and the desk where she used to work on her charity projects. It was a sanctuary he rarely visited, as the memories were still painfully vivid. Marco's room was also empty, although his school clothes were carefully folded on the bed, and his backpack was organized for the next day. Rosa was meticulous in her responsibilities, a quality Vinny deeply appreciated. In a world where trust was a rare commodity, she had proven to be not only competent, but genuinely dedicated to Marco's well-being. It was then that he heard voices coming from the winter garden, an environment Isabella had created on the house's ground floor. It was a bright space, with large windows offering a view of the private garden, decorated with tropical plants and wicker furniture that created a relaxing and welcoming atmosphere. Vinny rarely frequented that room, associating it too much with memories of his wife, but apparently Rosa and Marco had adopted the space. He approached silently, his survival instincts making him walk on tiptoe. It wasn't paranoia, but rather the result of decades living in a world where constant vigilance was the difference between life and death. Through the half-open door, he could see Rosa sitting on the floor on a colorful blanket, with Marco in front of her. Both were concentrated on something he couldn't completely identify. "Very good, Marco," Rosa was saying in her careful English, marked by a Mexican accent she had never tried to hide. "Now tell me, what do you feel when you see this image?" Vinny positioned himself to have a better view of the scene, staying hidden behind the doorframe. Rosa was holding what appeared to be an illustrated book, and Marco was observing the pages with a concentration he rarely demonstrated during homework sessions. The boy was sitting cross-legged, his small hands resting on his knees, and his expression was one of genuine curiosity. "I feel sadness," Marco said slowly, as if carefully choosing each word. "The boy in the picture looks lonely, like I feel sometimes when Daddy has to work late." Vinny's heart contracted upon hearing his son's words. He knew his absences were frequent and necessary, but hearing Marco verbalize his loneliness was like receiving a punch to the stomach. He leaned forward more, trying to see the book Rosa was using better. "That's a very intelligent observation," Rosa responded, her voice filled with affection and patience. "And what do you think could make this boy feel better?" Marco thought for a moment, biting his lower lip in a way that reminded him of Isabella when she was concentrated. Maybe if someone talked to him, or if he had a friend to play with. "Exactly," said Rosa, turning the page. "Sometimes when we feel lonely or sad, it's important to talk about our feelings. There's nothing wrong with feeling these emotions. They're part of who we are." Vinny watched, fascinated, as Rosa continued the session. She wasn't simply reading a story to Marco. She was conducting what appeared to be a form of emotional therapy, helping the boy identify and process his feelings in a way Vinny had never considered. In his world, emotions were often seen as weaknesses, vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemies. "Rosa," Marco said hesitantly, "can I tell you a secret?" "Of course, dear. You can tell me anything." Marco looked around, as if checking if they were really alone, a gesture that made Vinny's heart race. "Sometimes I have nightmares about Mommy. I dream that she's trying to tell me something, but I can't hear what she's saying." Rosa put the book aside and approached Marco, enveloping him in a gentle embrace. "Oh, my dear boy, it's completely normal to have those dreams. Your mommy was a very special person, and it's natural that you miss her." Vinny felt tears sting his eyes. He didn't know Marco was having nightmares, and guilt hit him like a wave. As a father, he should be aware of his son's fears and concerns, but his professional responsibilities had created a distance he hadn't perceived until that moment. "Do you think she's okay where she is now?" asked Marco, his voice small and vulnerable. "I believe so," Rosa replied softly, "and I think she would be very proud of the brave and intelligent boy you're becoming." "She may not be here physically, but the love she felt for you is still here," she said, gently touching Marco's chest. "In your heart." Vinny had to lean against the wall, feeling emotionally overwhelmed. Rosa was offering Marco something that he, despite all his power and resources, hadn't been able to provide: a safe space to process the loss of his mother and express his emotions without judgment. "Rosa," Marco continued, "can you teach me how to talk to other people about my feelings? Sometimes I want to tell Daddy about the nightmares, but I don't want to make him sad." Marco's question was like a stab to Vinny's heart. His son was emotionally protecting him, assuming a responsibility that shouldn't belong to an 8-year-old child. Vinny realized that in his attempt to protect Marco from the brutal realities of his professional life, he had inadvertently created a barrier that prevented genuine emotional communication between them. "Of course I can," said Rosa, taking another book from a pile beside the blanket. "Let's learn about different ways to express our feelings. And remember, your daddy loves you very much. He may be busy, but that doesn't mean he doesn't want to hear about what you're feeling." Vinny watched as Rosa opened a book about emotional intelligence for children. The pages were colorful and full of illustrations showing children in different emotional situations. It was clear she had researched and carefully selected appropriate materials to help Marco develop emotional skills that Vinny didn't even know existed. "Let's practice," said Rosa. "Imagine you want to tell your daddy about a difficult day at school. How would you start that conversation?" Marco thought for a moment. "I could say, 'Daddy, can I talk to you about something that happened today?' Perfect. And if he's busy at that moment, I could ask when would be a good time for us to talk." Exactly. Communication is about mutual respect. You respect his time, and he should respect your feelings. Vinny was impressed with the sophistication of Rosa's approach. She wasn't just taking care of Marco, she was educating him in life skills that would be valuable throughout his existence. In contrast, Vinny realized that his own emotional education had been practically non-existent, shaped by an environment where showing vulnerability was dangerous. "Now," said Rosa, "let's talk about different types of feelings. Sometimes we feel more than one emotion at the same time, and that's perfectly normal." She showed Marco a page with faces expressing different emotions: joy, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, disgust. "Can you give me an example of when you felt 2 different emotions at the same time?" Marco thought carefully. "When Daddy took me to see the Red Sox game last month, I was very happy to be with him, but I was also nervous because there were many people in the stadium." "That's a very mature observation," Rosa praised. "Happiness and nervousness can coexist. We don't need to choose just one emotion to feel." Vinny remembered that day at Fenway Park. He had noticed that Marco seemed a bit uncomfortable with the crowd, but had interpreted it as normal shyness. It hadn't occurred to him to explore the complex feelings his son was experiencing or help him process those emotions. The session continued for another 20 minutes, with Rosa guiding Marco through breathing exercises to manage anxiety, techniques to identify emotional triggers, and strategies to communicate needs assertively but respectfully. It was like watching a masterclass in emotional intelligence, and Vinny found himself absorbing the lessons as much as his son. "Remember," said Rosa as she put away the books, "feelings aren't right or wrong. They simply are. What matters is how we choose to respond to them." "Rosa," said Marco, hugging her spontaneously, "thank you for teaching me these things. I feel braver now." "You were always brave, dear. I'm just helping you recognize the courage that already exists within you." Vinny felt a complex mixture of emotions: deep gratitude that Rosa was providing Marco with something so valuable, guilt for not having recognized these needs before, and growing admiration for the woman who had become much more than a simple domestic employee. She was an educator, an informal therapist, and clearly someone who understood the emotional needs of a child who had lost his mother. He quietly moved away from the door, going upstairs to his room. He needed a few minutes to process what he had witnessed before joining them. Sitting on the edge of his king-size bed, Vinny looked at the framed photograph of Isabella he kept on the nightstand. She was smiling, holding baby Marco, and her eyes shone with the happiness of a fulfilled mother. "Bella," he murmured to the photograph, "I think I found someone who can help our boy in a way I didn't know he needed." Vinny realized he had completely underestimated Rosa Martinez. She wasn't just a competent employee, she was an educated and perceptive woman who had identified Marco's emotional needs and taken the initiative to address them professionally and lovingly. This raised questions about his own approach to parenting and about the type of emotional environment he was creating for his son. He stood up and walked to the window that offered a view of the private garden. The trees were beginning to lose their leaves, creating a golden and red carpet on the perfectly maintained lawn. It was a scene of tranquil beauty that contrasted with the emotional turbulence he felt internally. Vinny knew he needed to rethink many things about his life and priorities. What he had witnessed in the winter garden was more than a simple lesson. It was a revelation about the type of father he wanted to be and the type of man he wanted Marco to become. And at the center of this revelation was Rosa Martinez, a woman who had entered their lives as an employee, but who was revealing herself as something much more significant. He breathed deeply, adjusted his shirt, and prepared to go downstairs and join them for dinner. But now, his perspective had fundamentally changed. He was no longer simply returning home after a day of work. He was about to initiate a conversation that could redefine his relationship with his son and his understanding of what it really meant to be a present and emotionally available father. Vinny descended the stairs with slower steps than usual, each step echoing softly on the polished marble. His mind was buzzing with the implications of what he had witnessed, and he felt like a man who had just discovered he had been navigating with an incomplete map. The voices coming from the kitchen, Marco's crystalline laughter mixed with Rosa's warm tone, created a domestic symphony that contrasted drastically with the tense silence of the meetings he had conducted during the day. The Torino mansion's kitchen was an example of functional elegance, with black granite countertops, state-of-the-art stainless steel appliances, and a large central island where the family usually had informal meals. Isabella had insisted on creating a space that was both sophisticated and welcoming, a place where they could gather as a family away from the formalities of the main dining room. "Daddy!" exclaimed Marco upon seeing him enter, his eyes lighting up with genuine joy that always melted Vinny's heart. The boy was sitting on one of the high stools, helping Rosa prepare what appeared to be an elaborate salad. His small hands were carefully tearing lettuce leaves, and there was a serious concentration on his face that reminded Vinny of himself as a child, always determined to do everything perfectly. "Hi, champ," Vinny replied, kissing the top of Marco's head and inhaling the familiar smell of children's shampoo mixed with the aroma of spices Rosa was using for dinner. "You arrived early today. How was school?" "It was great. Mrs. Henderson said my solar system project was one of the best in the class," Marco said proudly, his eyes shining with the satisfaction of recognized achievement. "And Rosa helped me understand better about astronauts' emotions when they're away from home for a long time." Vinny looked at Rosa, who was seasoning what appeared to be a traditional Mexican dish. She wore a simple apron over a conservative navy blue dress, and her dark hair was pulled back in a low bun that highlighted her delicate features. There was a natural dignity in her posture, a silent confidence that spoke of a woman who knew her own worth, regardless of her professional position. "Mr. Torino," said Rosa, turning to greet him with a respectful but warm smile. "I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of preparing mole poblano tonight." Marco expressed curiosity about Mexican cuisine, and I thought it would be a good educational opportunity. "Of course, no problem," Vinny replied, intrigued by how Rosa always found ways to transform everyday activities into learning experiences. "Marco, are you enjoying learning about different cultures?" "Yes, Rosa told me about Day of the Dead traditions in Mexico and how families honor people who have already died," Marco said, his voice becoming softer when mentioning the theme of death. "She said it's a beautiful way to remember the people we love." Vinny felt a lump in his throat. Rosa had found a culturally sensitive way to help Marco process the loss of his mother, using traditions from her own heritage to create a context of understanding and acceptance. It was an approach that demonstrated not only cultural sensitivity, but also a deep understanding of the emotional needs of a grieving child. "That's very interesting," said Vinny, sitting on the stool next to Marco. "Rosa, could you tell us more about these traditions?" Rosa paused in her preparation, cleaning her hands on a dish towel before turning to them. "Well, in Mexico, We believe that death is not the end, but a transition. During the Day of the Dead, we create altars called ofrendas to honor our departed loved ones. We place their favorite foods, photographs, and things they loved in life. It's like they're still part of the family, Marco added, demonstrating that he had deeply absorbed the concept. Rosa said that love doesn't die when people die. Vinny looked at Rosa with growing admiration. She had managed to address a topic that he himself struggled to discuss with Marco, transforming it into a lesson about continuity, love, and memory. In his world, death was often brutal and final, but Rosa was teaching his son to see it through a lens of celebration and continued connection. My grandmother used to say that as long as we remember someone and talk about them, they continue to live in our hearts, said Rosa, her eyes softening with the memory. She taught me that the stories we tell about the people we love are gifts we give to them and to ourselves. Daddy, Marco said hesitantly, could you tell me more stories about Mommy? Sometimes I'm afraid of forgetting what her voice sounded like. Marco's request hit Vinny like lightning. He had avoided talking about Isabella, thinking he was protecting his son from pain. But he now realized that his reluctance had deprived Marco of precious connections with his mother's memory. Rosa had created a safe space where these conversations could happen naturally. Of course, champ, said Vinny, his voice slightly hoarse with emotion. Your mother had a laugh that could be heard from anywhere in the house, and she sang to you every night when you were a baby, Italian songs that my grandmother had taught her. Marco smiled, and Vinny could see that the boy was treasuring every word. Could you teach me some of those songs? It would be an honor, Vinny replied, realizing he was embarking on emotional territory he had avoided for 2 years. Maybe we can start tonight at bedtime. Rosa continued preparing dinner, but Vinny noticed the subtle smile that crossed her face. She had masterfully orchestrated a situation that allowed father and son to connect on a deeper level without forcing or manipulating the conversation. It was a skill that spoke of experience and refined emotional intuition. Rosa, said Vinny, may I ask about your background? You seem to have very specific knowledge about child development. Rosa paused, as if deciding how much to reveal. I studied child psychology at the National Autonomous University of Mexico before moving to the United States, she said finally. I worked with children who had lost parents in difficult situations in Mexico City. Vinny caught the hesitation in her voice and realized there was more to Rosa's story than she was revealing. The mention of difficult situations in Mexico City could mean many things, but his experience in the underworld told him that Rosa had probably worked with children affected by violence, possibly related to organized crime that plagued certain parts of Mexico. That explains a lot, said Vinny carefully. Marco clearly benefits from your experience. Every child deserves to feel heard and understood, Rosa replied simply, especially those who have faced significant losses. The dinner that followed was a revelation for Vinny. Rosa had prepared not just a delicious meal, but a complete cultural experience. She explained the ingredients of mole poblano, the history behind the dish, and how different regions of Mexico had their own variations. Marco asked intelligent questions, demonstrating a curiosity about the world that Vinny hadn't noticed before. In my hometown of Puebla, said Rosa while serving dessert, a homemade flan that melted in the mouth, my mother always said that cooking was a form of love. Each ingredient carries the intention of whoever prepares it, like the love you put in the food you make for us, Marco said innocently, making Rosa blush slightly. Vinny observed the interaction with growing understanding. Rosa wasn't just taking care of Marco, she was emotionally investing in his well-being in a way that went far beyond her professional obligations. And Marco was responding to this genuine attention in a way Vinny hadn't seen since Isabella's death. After dinner, while Rosa cleaned the kitchen and Marco finished his homework at the kitchen table, Vinny found himself observing the dynamic between them. There was a natural ease in their interactions, a non-verbal communication that spoke of mutual trust and genuine affection. Rosa gently corrected Marco's mistakes in his math homework, celebrated his successes, and offered encouragement when he became frustrated. Rosa, said Vinny when Marco went upstairs to brush his teeth. "I'd like to talk to you about something I observed today." Rosa turned, her hands still holding the dish towel, and Vinny could see slight tension in her shoulders. "Of course, Mr. Torino. Is something wrong?" "On the contrary," said Vinny quickly, noticing her anxiety. I saw you two in the winter garden today. The session about emotions." Rosa became still, and Vinny could see she was preparing for a possible confrontation. "I should have asked permission first," she said carefully. "If you prefer that I don't." "No," Vinny interrupted. "You didn't understand. I want to thank you. What you're doing for Marco, it's something I didn't know he needed, but clearly does." Relief was visible on Rosa's face. "Marco is a very special child, Mr. Torino. He has natural emotional intelligence, but needs guidance to develop it completely, especially considering the loss he suffered." "Could you teach me?" asked Vinny abruptly, surprising himself with the vulnerability of the question. "Those techniques you're using with him, I'd like to learn so I can support him better." Rosa studied his face for a moment as if evaluating his sincerity. "Of course," she said finally. "It would be an honor to help you connect even more with Marco." In that moment, Vinny realized that Rosa Martinez had become much more than an employee in his house. She was an educator, an informal therapist, and possibly the key to helping him become the type of father Marco deserved. But more than that, she was challenging his own conceptions about strength, vulnerability, and what it really meant to protect those we love. "There's one thing I'd like to understand," said Vinny, choosing his words carefully. "Why did you choose to work as a domestic employee when you clearly have qualifications to work in your field of training?" Rosa hesitated, and Vinny could see he had touched on something sensitive. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "circumstances force us to make choices that aren't ideal, but are necessary for our safety and survival." The answer confirmed Vinny's suspicions that there was more to Rosa's story than she was revealing. His experience told him she had probably fled from something, possibly violence related to organized crime in Mexico. The irony of the situation didn't escape him. A woman who had fled from criminal violence had found refuge in the house of one of Boston's most powerful organized crime figures. "Well," said Vinny finally, "I'm grateful for whatever circumstances brought you to our family. Marco, both of us, are better for having you here." Rosa smiled, and for the first time since arriving at the Torino house, Vinny saw something beyond careful professionalism in her eyes. There was gratitude, relief, and perhaps the beginning of something that could develop into genuine trust. "Daddy," called Marco from upstairs, "are you going to teach me those songs that Mommy liked?" "Coming, champ," Vinny replied, but before leaving the kitchen, he turned to Rosa one last time. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." As he climbed the stairs to Marco's room, Vinny reflected on how a single day had fundamentally altered his perspective on his family, his parenting, and the extraordinary woman who had entered their lives. He was beginning to realize that true strength wasn't in hiding emotions or maintaining distance, but in creating authentic and vulnerable connections with those who mattered most. And at the center of this revelation was Rosa Martinez, a woman who had transformed a house into a home, a lonely boy into an emotionally aware child, and a distant father into someone who was ready to learn to love in a completely new way. Saturday morning arrived with golden light filtering through the linen curtains of Vinny's room, creating dancing patterns on the cream-colored walls. It was the first weekend in months that he had decided to keep completely free of professional commitments, a decision that had surprised both Tommy and his other associates. But the events of the previous night, the emotional conversation with Marco, the Italian songs they had sung together until the boy fell asleep, and the new understanding about Rosa had created an urgency in Vinny to reconnect with his personal life. He descended the stairs barefoot, wearing only a navy blue polo shirt and cotton pants, an informality he rarely allowed himself. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and something that smelled like cinnamon and vanilla came from the kitchen, mixing with the low sound of traditional Mexican music and Marco's occasional laughter. It was a domestic symphony that Vinny was learning to appreciate in a completely new way. In the kitchen, he found a scene that made him pause at the entrance. Rosa was teaching Marco to make churros, her hands guiding his as he tried to form the elongated shapes of the dough. Both were covered in flour, and Marco had a spot of sugar and cinnamon on his nose that made him look even younger than his 8 years. "Very good, Marco," Rosa was saying in Spanish, then translating to English. "Now you squeeze gently, así, just like that." "Perfecto," exclaimed Marco, clearly proud to use the Spanish word Rosa had taught him. "Rosa, can you teach me more words in Spanish?" "Of course, mi niño. How about we start with words for family? Padre is father, madre is mother." Vinny approached silently, fascinated by the ease with which Rosa was introducing Marco to a new language and culture. It was more than a cooking lesson. It was a complete cultural immersion that was expanding his son's horizons in ways he had never considered. "Buenos dias," said Vinny, trying to use the little Spanish he remembered from his occasional interactions with Mexican associates in business. Marco turned with his eyes shining with excitement. "Daddy, Rosa is teaching me to make churros and speak Spanish. Did you know that corazon means heart?" "I didn't know," Vinny admitted, smiling at Rosa. "It seems you two are having a very productive morning." Rosa blushed slightly, cleaning her hands on her apron. "I hope you don't mind, Mr. Torino. Marco expressed interest in learning about different cultures, and I thought it would be educational." "Rosa," Vinny interrupted gently, "you don't need to justify yourself. What you're doing is wonderful. Actually, I was thinking, would you like to accompany us on an outing today? I thought of taking Marco to the Science Museum, and it would be great to have your educational perspective." Surprise was evident on Rosa's face. In 6 months working for the Torino family, she had never been invited to family activities outside the home. It would be an honor," she said carefully, "but I don't want to intrude." "You wouldn't be intruding," said Vinny firmly. "You're part of this family now." The words came out before he could censor them, and Vinny realized he had expressed something he had been feeling subconsciously for weeks. Rosa wasn't just an employee. She had become an integral presence in their lives, someone whose absence would be deeply felt. Marco jumped with joy. "Yes, Rosa, you'll love the planetarium. And you can help me understand the scientific explanations in English when I don't understand a word." 2 hours later, the three were walking through the corridors of the Boston Science Museum. Vinny had opted to drive his personal BMW X7 instead of using the Escalade with Tommy, a decision that symbolized his attempt to completely separate his family life from his professional responsibilities. Rosa wore a simple but elegant burgundy dress, and there was something different in her posture, less formal, more relaxed, as if she too was allowing herself to step out of her strictly professional role. "Look, Daddy," exclaimed Marco, running toward an interactive exhibit about the solar system. "It's just like the project I did for school." Vinny watched as Rosa joined Marco at the exhibit, explaining complex astronomical concepts in a way an 8-year-old boy could understand. She had a natural gift for education, an ability to make learning engaging and accessible. Other museum visitors occasionally stopped to listen to her explanations, attracted by the clarity and enthusiasm of her approach. "Rosa," said an elderly woman who had been listening, "are you a teacher? Your explanation about the moon phases was better than anything I heard at my grandchildren's school." Rosa smiled modestly. "Thank you. I studied child psychology and have always had a passion for education." Vinny noticed how Rosa had responded without lying, but also without revealing her current employment situation. There was a dignity in her response that spoke of someone who didn't define herself by her current occupation, but by her qualifications and passions. As they walked through the ocean exhibit, Marco asked a question that caught Vinny off guard. "Rosa, do you have family in Mexico? Do you miss them?" Rosa paused, and Vinny could see a shadow of sadness cross her face. "I have a younger sister," she said carefully. "She's still studying at university. Yes, I miss them very much." "Why can't you visit her?" asked Marco with the innocent curiosity of a child. "Sometimes," said Rosa, choosing her words carefully, "situations are complicated and it's not safe to travel." Vinny caught the implication immediately. Rosa couldn't return to Mexico for safety reasons, confirming his suspicions that she had fled from some type of danger. His experience in the underworld told him this was probably related to cartels or other criminal organizations that made certain areas of Mexico dangerous for people who had witnessed or opposed their activities. "Well," said Marco with the simple wisdom of a child, "you have a family here now. Daddy and I are your American family." Marco's words made Rosa's eyes fill with tears, and she knelt down to hug him. "Thank you, mi niño. That means so much to me." Vinny felt a deep emotion witnessing the exchange. His son, even at 8 years old, had demonstrated an intuitive understanding about family that transcended blood ties. And Rosa, a woman who had lost her biological family due to dangerous circumstances, had found a new home with them. They had lunch at the museum cafe, a simple meal that turned into one of the most meaningful conversations Vinny had had in years. Rosa spoke about her childhood in Puebla, about her passion for helping children, and about her dreams of one day opening a school that combined traditional education with emotional development. Marco shared his own aspirations. He wanted to be an astronaut, or maybe a scientist who studied distant planets. "And you, Mr. Torino?" asked Rosa. "What were your dreams when you were Marco's age?" The question caught Vinny off guard. It had been decades since someone had asked about his childhood dreams. "I wanted to be an architect," he said slowly, surprised he still remembered. "I used to draw houses and buildings, imagining what it would be like to create spaces where people could be happy." "Do you still draw?" asked Marco, clearly fascinated by this revelation about his father. "There hasn't been much time for that," Vinny admitted. But even as he said it, he wondered why he had completely abandoned something that had once brought him so much joy. "Maybe you could draw something for me," Marco suggested. "Like my dream house." "I'd like that," said Vinny, realizing he was making a promise he intended to keep. In the afternoon, they visited the planetarium, where they sat in the darkness watching a presentation about the Milky Way. Marco was sitting between Vinny and Rosa, holding both their hands while the stars danced above them. It was a moment of family intimacy that Vinny hadn't experienced since before Isabella's death. "Daddy," Marco whispered in the darkness, "do you think Mommy can see us from some star up there?" The question could have been devastating, but Rosa had prepared Vinny for this type of conversation through her sessions with Marco. "I think Mommy's love is everywhere around us," Vinny replied softly. "In the stars, in the wind, and especially here in your heart. And in your heart too, Daddy. Especially in my heart," Vinny confirmed, squeezing his son's small hand. During the drive home, Marco fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted by the day's excitement. Rosa turned to check if he was comfortable, adjusting his seatbelt and covering him with a blanket she always carried in her purse. "Thank you for today," said Vinny, as he drove through Boston's familiar streets. "It was special." "For me too," Rosa replied softly. "Marco is an extraordinary child. You should be very proud." "I am, but I'm also realizing how much I was missing by always being busy with work." Rosa was silent for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Torino, may I ask a personal question?" "Of course." "Your work, is it dangerous?" The direct question surprised him. "Why do you ask?" "Marco sometimes mentions that you work with important business, and that there are men who always accompany you. And I recognize the signs of someone who lives with constant concerns about security." Vinny realized that Rosa was more observant than he had imagined. Her experience with violence in Mexico had given her a perspective that few possessed. "Yes," he said finally, "it can be dangerous." "Does Marco know?" "Not the details. I try to protect him from that part of my life. But he feels your tension," said Rosa gently. "Children are very perceptive. They may not understand the details, but they feel when their parents are worried or stressed." Vinny considered her words. "Do you have any suggestions?" "Maybe finding ways to be truly present when you're with him. Not just physically, but emotionally. Leaving work at work, even if it's just for a few hours. Like today. Exactly like today." When they arrived home, Vinny carried sleeping Marco to his room tucking him in with the care of a father who was learning to value every moment. Rosa had prepared chamomile tea, and the two sat in the living room, an informality that would have been unthinkable just a week before. "Rosa," said Vinny, "I'd like to know more about your situation, if you feel comfortable sharing." Rosa hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "I worked at a community clinic in Mexico City, helping children who had been traumatized by cartel violence. One day, I witnessed something I shouldn't have seen. Important men doing terrible things. When they discovered I knew, I had to flee. And your sister? She's safe. She studies at a university in another city, and they have no interest in her. But I can't go back." Vinny nodded, completely understanding the situation. "You're safe here," he said firmly. "I guarantee that." Rosa looked at him with gratitude. "Thank you. That means more than you can imagine." In that moment, Vinny realized he had found something he didn't know he was looking for. Rosa wasn't just an employee or even an educator for Marco. She was an extraordinary woman who had faced real dangers to protect innocent children, who had sacrificed her career and family to do what was right, and now she was bringing that same courage and compassion to his family. "Rosa," he said, "I'd like to make a proposal. How about you officially become Marco's tutor, with an appropriate salary for your qualifications and the freedom to develop a complete educational program for him?" Rosa's eyes widened. "Mr. Torino, that would be incredible. But are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Vinny replied. "Marco needs you, and to be honest, so do I." As Rosa went up to her room that night, Vinny remained in the living room, reflecting on how his life had changed in just a few days. He had started the week as a mafia boss focused only on power and control, and was ending it as a father who was learning that true strength came from vulnerability and genuine human connection. And at the center of this transformation was Rosa Martinez, a woman who had lost everything to protect innocent children and who was now helping him find a better version of himself. A woman who was becoming much more than he had ever imagined possible. 3 weeks had passed since the day at the museum, and the Torino house had transformed in a way Vinny could never have anticipated. What had once been an elegant but silent residence had become a vibrant home, full of laughter, conversations in 2 languages, and the constant sound of learning happening in every room. Rosa had officially accepted the position as Marco's tutor, and her influence extended far beyond formal education. It was a particularly cold November morning, with the season's first snowflakes beginning to fall over Beacon Hill. Vinny was in his home office, an environment that had been redesigned in recent weeks to accommodate a new reality. Where before, there had been only an imposing desk and leather chairs for occasional meetings, there was now also a drafting table he had ordered installed, an investment in a childhood dream that Rosa had gently encouraged him to rediscover. He was working on an architectural sketch, not of a dream house for Marco, as he had initially promised, but of something much more ambitious. It was the design of a school, inspired by the conversations he had had with Rosa about her dreams of creating an educational environment that combined academic learning with emotional development. The drawing was slowly taking shape, with open and bright classrooms, spaces for art and music, and gardens where children could connect with nature. "Daddy," said Marco, entering the office with Rosa right behind him, "can you show us what you're drawing?" Vinny smiled, covering the drawing with a blank sheet. "It's not ready yet, champ. It's a surprise." Marco made a frustrated face, but Rosa placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Remember what we talked about regarding patience and respecting others' creative process?" "Yes," Marco sighed. "Sorry, Daddy, I'm just very curious." "And curiosity is a wonderful thing," said Vinny, getting up from the drafting table. "But Rosa is right about patience. Some surprises are worth waiting for." Rosa smiled, and Vinny noticed how she had changed in recent weeks. There was a growing confidence in her posture, a sense of belonging that had replaced the professional caution she had initially maintained. She wore more casual clothes now, jeans and comfortable sweaters that made her look younger and more relaxed. Her hair was loose today, falling in soft waves over her shoulders, and there was a brightness in her eyes that spoke of someone who had found their place in the world. "Actually," said Rosa, "we came here because Marco has something important to tell you." Marco straightened up, assuming a formal posture that made Vinny smile. "Daddy, Rosa and I have been working on a special project. We want to present it to you." "A project?" asked Vinny, intrigued. "Yes. Rosa helped me research our family, the Torino family. We discovered incredible things about our ancestors." Vinny felt a pang of anxiety. The Torino family history included aspects he definitely didn't want Marco to discover. "What kind of things?" Rosa seemed to notice his concern. "We focused on the immigration history and the legitimate contributions the family made to the Boston community," she said quickly. Marco was fascinated with the stories about how his great-grandfather built the family's first business. "Daddy, did you know that great-great-grandfather Giuseppe arrived here with only $20 in his pocket?" said Marco, using the Italian word for great-grandfather that Rosa had taught him. "And he built a bakery that fed the entire Italian community in the North End." Vinny relaxed, realizing that Rosa had skillfully navigated the family history, highlighting the positive aspects while carefully avoiding the darker elements. "Yes, he was a very hard-working man," said Vinny, "and very proud of his Italian heritage. Rosa taught me some recipes that were from his family," Marco continued excitedly. "Can we make bread together on the weekend?" "Of course," said Vinny, touched by how Rosa was helping Marco connect with his roots in a positive and constructive way. It would be an honor to continue that tradition. Vinny's phone rang. The business phone he had tried to ignore more frequently in recent weeks. Sal Castellano's name appeared on the screen, and Vinny hesitated before answering. "Excuse me," he said to Rosa and Marco. "I need to take this quickly." "Vinny," said Sal's voice from the other end of the line, tense and urgent. "We need to meet. Today. The Irish made a move that changed everything." "What happened?" "I can't talk over the phone. Cafe Vittoria, 1 o'clock. The call ended, and Vinny felt the familiar weight of responsibility descending on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. He looked at Marco and Rosa, who were watching him with worried expressions. "Do you need to leave?" asked Rosa softly. "Yes," said Vinny, hating the disappointment he saw in Marco's eyes. "But I promise I'll be back in time for dinner, and tomorrow we make the bread." Marco nodded, but Vinny could see the boy was struggling to hide his sadness. It was a pattern that had repeated many times over the years. Promises made and then broken due to the relentless demands of his professional life. "Marco," said Rosa gently, "how about we use this time to work on the family album we're creating? We can organize the photos we found and write the stories your father told us." "Okay," said Marco, clearly trying to be brave. Vinny knelt down to his son's height. "Champ, I know I have to leave a lot for work, and I know that sometimes makes you sad." Marco looked down, biting his lip. "I understand that your work is important, Daddy." "It is important," Vinny agreed, "but you are more important, and I'm working to find a better balance. Promise?" "I promise." An hour later, Vinny was sitting at the familiar table in the back of Cafe Vittoria, observing Sal Castellano's somber expression. The older man seemed to have aged years in just a few weeks, and there was a tension in his movements that spoke of extreme stress. "Patrick O'Sullivan is dead," said Sal without preamble. Vinny felt like he had been punched in the stomach. "How?" "Bullet to the head last night. They found the body at the port. But here's the problem. It wasn't us. And now all the Irish think it was our order. Who else could it have been?" "That's the million-dollar question," said Sal, taking a sip of his espresso. "But there are rumors that someone inside our organization is playing a very dangerous game." Vinny processed the information quickly. Patrick O'Sullivan's death would trigger a gang war that could devastate Boston. And if there was a traitor in their ranks, the situation was even more dangerous than it appeared. "What do you know about the rumors?" "Michael Castellano has been very quiet lately," said Sal, referring to his youngest son. "And some of the younger men have been asking questions about when we're going to modernize our operations." The implication was clear. The new generation was impatient with traditional methods and might be taking drastic measures to force a change. It was exactly the type of situation Vinny had feared since taking leadership of the family. "We need a meeting with all the bosses," said Vinny. "Tonight. And I want all the young men present too. Already organized. Warehouse in the South End, 8 o'clock. Vinny nodded, but his mind was already returning home to Marco and Rosa. The irony of the situation didn't escape him. At the moment he was finally learning to balance his personal and professional life, a crisis threatened to destroy everything he had built. When he arrived home, he found Marco and Rosa in the living room, surrounded by old photographs and family documents. They had created a visual timeline of Torino history, highlighting moments of pride and achievement. It was a project that celebrated the family's positive legacy while carefully ignoring its darker aspects. "How was the meeting?" asked Rosa, studying his face with the sharp perception of someone who had learned to read signs of danger. "Complicated," Vinny admitted. "I might have to work late tonight." The disappointment on Marco's face was like a stab. "But you promised we'd make bread tomorrow." "And we will," said Vinny firmly. "No matter what happens tonight, tomorrow is our day." Rosa approached him, lowering her voice. "Is it dangerous?" "Potentially. Do you want me to take Marco out tomorrow? To keep him away from home if there are complications?" Vinny looked at her with gratitude. Rosa instinctively understood the risks of his life without him needing to explain the details. "That would be a good idea," he said. "Maybe the Natural History Museum. He's been talking about wanting to see the dinosaurs." "Of course." That night, Vinny found himself in a warehouse in the South End, surrounded by men who had been his allies for decades, but who now looked at each other with suspicion. The meeting was tense, with veiled accusations and vehement denials. Michael Castellano, in particular, seemed overly defensive, and Vinny began to suspect the young man might be involved in O'Sullivan's death. "Someone is trying to turn us against each other," said Vinny to the assembled group. "And until we find out who, we're all in danger." The meeting extended until the early morning hours, without clear resolutions, but with an agreement to increase security and discreetly investigate recent events. When Vinny finally arrived home, the house was silent, but he noticed a light on in the kitchen. Rosa was there, preparing coffee and what appeared to be bread dough. "I thought you might want to start early," she said softly. "Marco is very excited." "Rosa," said Vinny, sitting heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, "there's something you need to know. Things might get dangerous in the coming days. If you want to take Marco and stay at a hotel for a while." "No," said Rosa firmly. "This is our home, and you're going to need support. It could be very dangerous." "I've faced danger before," she reminded him, "and I learned that running isn't always the answer. Sometimes you need to stay and fight for what's important." Vinny looked at her with admiration that went far beyond the professional. Rosa wasn't just brave, she was loyal in a way he had rarely encountered in his world. "Thank you," he said simply. "We're a family," said Rosa, "and families protect each other." When Marco came down for breakfast an hour later, he found his father and Rosa working side by side in the kitchen, preparing the dough for traditional Italian bread. The boy joined them enthusiastically, and for a few precious hours, Vinny managed to completely forget the dangerous world that existed beyond his house's walls. As the bread baked in the oven, filling the kitchen with the aroma that had defined Vinny's childhood in the North End, he realized he had found something worth more than all the power and money he had accumulated over the years. He had found a true family, not just connected by blood or forced loyalty, but united by love, mutual respect, and the conscious choice to be together. And at the center of this family was Rosa Martinez, a woman who had lost everything to protect innocent children, who had found refuge in his house, and who was now helping him discover what kind of man he really wanted to be. A woman who was becoming not just Marco's tutor, but the emotional heart of his family. As he watched Marco and Rosa laughing together while decorating the bread with sesame seeds, Vinny made a decision that would change everything. It was time to begin gradually stepping away from the business that had defined his life for so long. It was time to build a different legacy, one that Marco could inherit with pride, and he knew exactly where to start. The school project he was drawing wouldn't just be a dream on paper. It would be real. It would be for children like Marco, who deserved an education that honored both their minds and their hearts. And Rosa would be the principal, finally realizing the dream that had been interrupted by violence in her homeland. "Rosa!" he said as they took the golden bread from the oven. "Would you like to see the project I'm working on? I think it's time to share the surprise." Her eyes sparkled with curiosity and expectation. "It would be an honor." And so, on a November morning in Boston, with the smell of fresh bread in the air and snow falling gently outside, Vincent Torino began to build a future that would honor both his past and his dreams for tomorrow. A future where power would be measured not by the ability to inspire fear, but by the skill to nurture hope. A future where his family, including the extraordinary woman who had transformed his house into a home, could flourish in safety and love.